Aviation experts are in utter shock after discovering jaw-dropping flaws inside the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, the plane once sold as the future of air travel. The so-called crown jewel of Boeing is now being exposed as a flying patchwork of errors that should have never left the factory. And the worst part? These aren't tiny slip-ups, they're problems that could bring the whole jet crashing down, literally. But before we dive deep into this mess, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because it's the only way you'll get real aviation news every single day. So, as we all know, Boeing 787 was hyped as the aircraft that would finally change everything about flying. Boeing sold it as the plane that wasn't just another upgrade, but a revolution. It came with lighter carbon fiber wings instead of heavy aluminum, windows nearly a third larger than anything passengers had seen before, and a cabin designed to keep travelers fresher and less exhausted on long-haul flights. Airlines didn't hesitate, orders poured in worth hundreds of billions of dollars. For carriers, this wasn't just buying planes, it was buying into a vision of dominating the skies with a machine that looked like the future. But the glow around the Dreamliner didn't last long. What was marketed as Boeing's crown jewel is now whispered about as the company's biggest embarrassment. Experts digging into the aircraft say the revolutionary design is literally rotting from the inside. Corrosion and fatigue weren't supposed to be words attached to this jet, yet here they are. What was once a symbol of cutting-edge innovation has spiraled into the most controversial aircraft program in Boeing's history. The very plane meant to prove Boeing still led the world in aerospace has instead become a case study in how things can go very wrong. The breaking point came in March 2025, when the Federal Aviation Administration dropped a bombshell warning that shook the entire industry. Inspectors had found flaws in the Dreamliner's forward pressure bulkhead, the critical structure that keeps the cabin pressurized at 35,000 feet. Without it functioning perfectly, passengers and crew quite literally can't survive the flight. And yet, the FAA discovered that Boeing had let some of the most shocking errors slip through during production. Experts reviewing the findings were stunned to see a list of mistakes that looked more like a rookie builder's checklist than issues in a $200 million jet. There were improper gaps where there should have been tight seals. Fasteners were installed incorrectly, some not even meeting Boeing's own technical specifications. And instead of being isolated incidents, investigators found these same mistakes over and over again across different aircraft. These weren't accidents, they were built into the production system itself. The FAA didn't mince words either. They warned that while these flaws might not cause an immediate disaster, the danger would grow over time. Planes rack up stress with every flight, and Boeing's mistakes could trigger cracks, corrosion, or worse, catastrophic failure while airborne. For aviation experts, this was almost unthinkable. Boeing had once been the company that set the gold standard for safety. Now it was being accused of letting basic, preventable errors sit inside its most advanced plane. What makes the situation even worse is that these discoveries weren't tied to just one model or one factory. They stretched across the Dreamliner program as a whole. Experts called it proof that Boeing's problems went far deeper than a few bad inspections. The issues exposed a culture where meeting production schedules and cutting costs seemed to matter more than building aircraft that met the highest possible standard. Boeing's story with the Dreamliner took an even darker twist when details emerged about what insiders now call the company's shadow factories. These weren't your standard maintenance hangars or inspection bays. These were off-the-grid repair facilities set up specifically to deal with a massive backlog of defective 787s. At one point, more than 120 Dreamliners sat undelivered, parked like lemons in storage lots because they couldn't pass inspection. Boeing's answer wasn't to overhaul its production system. It was to quietly patch up those jets outside the public eye. The work being done in these shadow factories wasn't about polishing scratches or replacing seats. These were structural reworks on aircraft valued at over $200 million each. involving corrections to fuselage joins, bulkhead fixes, and improperly assembled sections. In aviation terms, this is like performing surgery with duct tape after the patient has already left the hospital. Airlines had signed contracts for brand new planes, but what they got instead were jets that had been retrofitted before ever flying a commercial mile. Even more troubling, passengers who boarded those gleaming 787s had no idea their so-called revolutionary aircraft had already been through a backroom rebuild. Experts say there's simply no precedent for this in modern aviation history. Manufacturers have always had to deal with production flaws, but to set up secret rework centers and deliver planes under the guise of being flawless? That crosses a line. Veteran engineers argue that this kind of secrecy raises alarming ethical questions. What else is being hidden, and how much risk are passengers being asked to take without knowing it? And just as the industry was trying to digest the implications of shadow factories, another nightmare surfaced, this time buried deep in the Dreamliner's communication system. The Federal Aviation Administration revealed that the aircraft's VHF radios, the backbone of pilot-to-tower communication, had a disturbing flaw. Instead of staying locked on the channel selected by the flight crew, these radios could switch between active and standby modes on their own, with no input from pilots. For an airline captain cruising at 35,000 feet, this isn't a minor glitch, it's a recipe for chaos. Air traffic control depends on constant, uninterrupted communication. A momentary silence might not seem like much on the ground, but in the sky, it can be the difference between a routine crossing and a fatal mid-air collision. The FAA's own documents admitted the defect could result in a catastrophic accident if left unresolved. What shocked experts further was the revelation that this wasn't just theoretical. Qatar Airways, one of Boeing's most important international customers, confirmed the communication issues persisted even after Boeing rolled out the FAA-recommended software patch. In other words, the supposed fix didn't actually fix the problem. For an airline with one of the world's most modern fleets to publicly admit this kind of failure, the signal to the industry was unmistakable. Boeing's promises were no longer trusted at face value. The fact that a flaw like this even existed left aviation veterans stunned. VHF communication is one of the most basic pillars of flight safety, a system that has worked reliably for decades across countless aircraft types. For the Dreamliner to introduce instability into something so essential suggested not just sloppy oversight, but a disturbing shift in Boeing's priorities. Instead of engineering perfection, the company seemed willing to accept shortcuts in systems where the margin for error is zero. When pressed, Boeing defended its aircraft by pointing to statistics. The company has repeatedly highlighted that the Dreamliner has logged more than 165,000 flight cycles without showing fatigue-related structural failures. But regulators clearly weren't convinced. The FAA moved ahead with directives requiring airlines to conduct mandatory inspections on every U.S.-registered 787, a program projected to cost $115,000 in total for the fleet. While that figure might look small compared to the billions involved in commercial aviation, experts point out the money isn't the issue, it's the signal. A regulator only mandates inspections when it doesn't believe the manufacturer's assurances. What adds another layer to this story is how public confidence has cratered. On the FAA's own website, anonymous comments from the public expressed raw anger and mistrust. One response read bluntly, "Given Boeing's history of prioritizing profits over passenger safety, I wouldn't fly on one of their planes if you paid me." This isn't just social media chatter. These are official submissions in response to regulatory proposals, highlighting just how deeply distrust has taken root. Airlines, too, have started showing signs of strain. Traditionally, carriers keep frustrations with manufacturers behind closed doors. Publicly calling out an aircraft maker can damage long-term relationships in an industry where reliability is everything. Yet now, major Boeing customers are doing exactly that. Qatar Airways openly acknowledged ongoing communication failures, and others have quietly hinted that repeated inspections and constant compliance costs are making the Dreamliner more of a burden than an asset. For an industry where reliability can make or break route planning, those whispers are almost as damaging as outright rebellion. The fallout doesn't end at Boeing's factories or in congressional chambers. It stretches all the way into airline boardrooms. For carriers who operate the Dreamliner, the reality is constant interruptions. Groundings, inspections, and structural fixes eat away at flight schedules and profitability. The FAA's most recent directive placed the inspection cost at $850 per aircraft. On paper, that might sound trivial compared to a fleet worth billions, but airlines don't just bleed from inspection bills, they bleed from lost flying time. When a wide-body jet sits idle, it isn't just an inconvenience, it's a blow to route reliability, crew planning, and customer trust. Multiply that across dozens of aircraft, and the economic sting becomes sharp. These mounting frustrations have quietly shifted industry loyalties. Carriers that once lined up for Boeing's latest offerings are now signing purchase agreements with Airbus, particularly for the A350, the Dreamliner's direct competitor. Airlines praise the A350 for what Boeing used to be known for: reliability, consistency, and engineering confidence. Every defection isn't just a lost sale. It's a signal to the market that Boeing's grip on long-haul dominance is slipping. Analysts have warned that this trend could reshape the aviation market entirely, weakening Boeing's historic duopoly and allowing Airbus to carve out long-term dominance. For experts, the 787's string of disasters doesn't exist in isolation. It follows a grim pattern etched across Boeing's modern history. The 737 MAX crashes in 2018 and 2019, which killed 346 people, remain a haunting reminder of what happens when cost-cutting is prioritized over design integrity. Investigations showed software flaws and inadequate pilot training, a direct reflection of the company's shifted priorities. Then came 2013, when every Dreamliner worldwide was grounded after multiple lithium-ion battery fires broke out. That episode should have been a wake-up call, but instead, it became just another chapter in a growing list. The most recent blow came in 2024, when a fuselage panel detached mid-flight on an Alaska Airlines 737. No one was killed, but the incident underscored that Boeing's quality control issues were not confined to the Dreamliner. They were systemic. Each of these events chips away at credibility, and together they paint a portrait of a manufacturer at war with its own legacy. What stuns industry veterans most is how far Boeing has fallen from its pedestal. The Dreamliner was meant to be the poster child of American innovation, a gleaming symbol of what U.S. engineering could accomplish in the 21st century. Instead, it has become a case study in corporate negligence, a byword for how a once great company can stumble when it abandons the very principles that built its reputation. This is why aviation analysts have stopped talking about patches and software updates. They argue nothing less than a systemic overhaul can rescue Boeing. The problems stretch from the supply chain that delivers flawed parts to the CEO suite where strategy is shaped. The central question being asked in aviation circles is stark. Does Boeing even prioritize engineering excellence anymore? On paper, the company insists safety remains its foundation, but the repeated scandals suggest otherwise. Incremental fixes won't restore trust. An $850 per aircraft inspection doesn't erase years of shortcuts, and a software patch doesn't undo a leadership culture focused on shareholders over passengers. Experts say what's required is nothing less than a cultural reset, a return to the days when engineers, not accountants, called the shots.